say to that person, no, I can't do that, or this is.
Completely. What I'm hearing a lot from you, and I think it's very different than the usual story that I hear, and my own story is that you did set, like, you were good at boundaries. You just didn't know it was called boundaries. And what you noticed was a pattern that every time you set a boundary, which for you, what I'm hearing, it was a little bit more natural, you would get a lot of pushback. That's what I'm
Yes.
hearing you say. Yeah, for me, it was very different.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I had no idea how to set them. And
Mm-hmm.
I was the type of person, which I'm sure a lot of you that are hearing me can relate, that saw boundaries as being selfish. So I felt like if I spoke up, if I said, no, you can't borrow my car, like the example you gave, was selfish. So I was sacrificing myself and betraying my own needs because of all of these labels and meanings that society attaches to boundaries. So
Mm-hmm.
when I heard the word boundaries and I started reading about it, and I realized in the books that setting boundaries was actually healthy, and it was
Mm-hmm.
only not only healthy, it's needed if you want a healthy relationship. For me, it was a completely eye opener, and I
Mm-hmm.
started setting them, and it was really hard. And I love that you talked about assertiveness. That's definitely one of my passions, because the moment that you start setting boundaries, it's very easy. If you've been a people pleaser for your whole life, seeking acceptance, avoiding criticism, avoiding rejection, if you've been that type of person, it's very easy that when you start setting boundaries, you go to the other extreme, and you
Mm-hmm.
become very aggressive in your words. So the word assertive for me, it's critical, because I think that when we're setting boundaries, it's really important to respect the other person while we're
Mm-hmm.
doing it, to not name call, to do it in a very confident position, not threatening position, and or not position, like body language, and the words you use, the Gottman method. I feel this is what I need, instead of putting all blame on the other person. Like, for me, that was critical. And it's very, very important that, that when people start setting boundaries, they know that there's a difference between being passive, assertive, passive aggressive, or aggressive, for the boundary to actually be called a boundary. Don't you? What do you think?
I agree with that, but I want to go back a second. I didn't always have boundaries.
Okay. Okay.
This was when I referenced that, I was talking about college when I started implementing them without knowing the word. I grew up in a family where it was kind of frowned upon to have boundaries. We grew up with this more like it's family approach, so people could kind of do anything. And it's like, well, that's your uncle or that's your cousin. So I had boundaries, but they were like, you should not have boundaries. So it was very frowned upon to
A
want
lot of
something
guilt
different.
tripping, very
Yeah,
guilt
a
tripping.
lot of guilt tripping. So even if I thought like that he shouldn't have did that, or this person, it was like, no, 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 no. That's your cousin. That's okay. So even though I thought like, I don't think this is right, like something is off here. I don't know if I was watching Oprah and they probably were talking about something. I'm like, I don't think we should do this anymore, right? My family would say like, no, no, this is okay because this is a part of our family, or we have to excuse this. So not until I moved out of my mother's home was I really able to set boundaries and accept the pushback from other people, because before, I'm 13, 14, I can't really tell my parents is what I want, but I can't really implement that if I am being taken care of them and being taken care of in some capacity by them. So even if I thought something was a little off, I could not yet act on it. And back to what you were saying about assertiveness and aggressiveness. Yes, I think Once you haven't had boundaries, most people go to aggressive because they don't really know how to implement the boundary. And so when they finally say something, it comes across very hard and mean and loud. And now you're screaming at the top of your lungs when really what you want to say is, this is what I need. This is what I would like in this situation. Instead, it comes across as, I'm tired of you doing X, Y, and Z. You're always taking advantage of me. But it's actually this one situation. So the aggressive piece often happens when we've gone so long without having any boundaries that we don't even know how to start. So we just go really hard. And we can, with practice in very small ways, start to set boundaries. I've fortunately, not necessarily with my father, but with my mother. My mother was open to hearing some things, some boundaries I was able to set. Like my mother is a very heavy smoker. And I was able to set the boundary of, please don't smoke in my room. Like she allowed that boundary. But there are other things where it's like, no, no, you can't do that here. So I think, in small ways, we can still do what we can with boundaries.
I agree. I agree. And the way I describe what you said about aggressiveness is like a balloon that starts getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And there's a point where it explodes and you can hear it explode. And I feel it's the same way with boundaries. Why did we call this live and allowing resentment to teach us about boundaries? Because resentment is the air inside the balloon. Every time you allow something that you don't agree with, that feels uncomfortable for you, that it doesn't even match your values and your level of comfort, and you are growing that resentment.
Mm-hmm.
And I see so many people in my practice that they come because of that resentment. It's not letting them live, it's not letting them have good relationships, and it's just full of resentment. And it can be, it's an explosion when it comes out because it's
Mm-hmm.
too much. So
Mm-hmm.
when we're able to stop pushing resentment on a side, because resentment can feel very uncomfortable. It's a feeling that it doesn't feel good at all. So we don't like to feel it. We push it away. We push it away instead of listening to it. I always say that, well, emotions, why are they there? To tell us something. It's information. Emotions are, yes, it's like Nicole says, energy, emotions, but they're also information. When we allow those emotions to teach us something, because they're there for a reason, what's really going on here, when we open ourselves to actually hear the messages that resentment is bringing us, then we're able to say, okay, clearly I am allowing all of this that I'm not okay with. So that's when we're able to access them. But if we push it away, then we're just uncomfortable, we're unhappy, we're anxious, we are mad, we are frustrated, and we have no idea why.
Mm-hmm.
And we go again into like a victim mode, like there's nothing we can do. People just take advantage of me,
Mm-hmm.
or they, yeah.
Well, I had a post a while ago, when you need boundaries, and basically the listicle was saying, whenever you feel something. So your feelings will tell you when you need boundaries. One of the things I think about is, tell me something that irritates you. That's an indicator you need boundaries. Tell me someone who pisses you off. That's an indicator you need boundaries. Tell me someone who is draining. That's an indicator you need boundaries. Like all of these things that we feel, for some reason, we feel like we don't have control of what we allow from other people, or what we're able to do in other situations. And we think like, oh my gosh, it's this person, it's this thing, and it's really us. It's not all of this other stuff pulling our strings. We are the puppet master. It's no one else. It's us. And that's really hard to accept, because we don't want to think that we are the person who should be doing the work. We want the other people to do the work and just have it all together, get it together, make our lives easier. But to really be healthy, you have to have some uncomfortable conversations. You have to have some uncomfortable interactions, and you have to say things multiple times. I know we do not like to repeat ourselves, but we have to repeat ourselves. I was just telling someone, like, if your boundary, like during this time, if your boundary is, hey, I don't want you to tell me about the news, and the next time you talk to that person and they bring the news up, you again have to say, hey, I don't want you to tell me about the news. Don't let them continue telling you, because now you have defaulted on your own boundary. You have to
Completely.
continue to tell them, hey, don't tell me about this. Um, I told you that I don't want to hear about, like, you have to stick up for your boundary. So yes, it's very easy to say, like, this person is doing that, this thing is happening, I'm overwhelmed with. And when we say those things, those are very clear indicators that we need boundaries and signs that there is work for us to do. Yes, other people can help us with that, but a lot of it is us naming what the boundary is, implementing it, and doing the really hard work of dealing with our discomfort. We don't like to make people upset. We don't want to have pushback. We don't want people to be mad at us or think we're mean. But that's a part of the process. We have to say something that's uncomfortable. How you say it matters. Like you said, being assertive. So yeah, if you say it assertively, especially if people are used to you being passive, they may take that as mean because they're used to you not saying anything. So if you never say anything and then all of a sudden you say, hey, I don't want to go, they're like, oh my gosh, you're being mean.
Completely,
You're
completely. And I always say it makes sense, you know? It makes sense. The person that's not making sense, it's the person setting the boundary after a whole life of passiveness, you know? It,
mm-hmm,
for the other person, it doesn't make sense. Why are you, you know, you've spent your whole life, every time I need you, you're there. Every time I call you, answer. If I want to open the door and enter your house without even calling you or knocking the door, you're fine with it. Why suddenly such a drastic change? Your role is completely changing in their life. You know,
mm-hmm,
your previous role of people pleaser, it served a purpose in your relationships. Now that you're completely changing your role and now you're becoming the protagonist of your own story, and you're saying no to things that you would previously don't even think about and just say yes, it has an effect on people and they are going to have to adapt. And for them to adapt, they are going to have to go through their own uncomfortable feelings. If
mm-hmm,
that if it's anger, it's anger. You know, anger is just a feeling. If it's sadness, is sadness. If it's grieving the person you used to be, it's grieving, you know. But they are going to have to go through their own process in order to understand this new person that you are. There's a post I wrote not so long ago that I literally thought about it while I was like about to go to sleep, and I wrote it down, and I want to read it because I think for many of you who are listening to this and have never set a boundary in your life and you want to start doing it, I think this is a nice this nice dialogue that you can have with someone, that it's for them first to warn them of your change. You're warning them of your change, and also to let them know that has nothing to do about them. Because if you're setting boundaries with someone that has very low self-esteem, is very insecure, they are going to take it personally, just as like they take anything else personally. So this may help. I'm going to read it right now. And I recently realized I have spent a lifetime trying to please people in order to seek approval. And I have completely forgotten to take care of myself and my needs. This has affected me in ways you cannot even imagine. You will probably notice starting now how I'm going to start saying no to requests I previously said yes to without even considering my needs. I will also be a little less available. can I count on you to support me in this process? This is just something I wrote to warn the people that you love that you're changing, and it's only because of your needs.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, maybe you read this or you say something that goes in line with this, and there's going to be people that are not going to accept this, and that has nothing to do with you. And that's not a signal for you to change your boundary. And that's critical, because if you change your boundary, if you know, set a boundary and then somebody gets angry and you then apologize and go back to people pleasing, then you're basically setting yourself up for failure, because you're giving the other person the message that their anger, it's a sign for you to take your boundary away. You know, they being comfortable, it's more important for you than you being uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And that thing, and I think that that's seeing it as a choice, you know, in how you're sacrificing yourself for other people to not be uncomfortable. I think that also changes a lot in the way you see boundaries, because people don't understand that it ends up being a choice between the
Mm-hmm.
other person and you, and the
Mm-hmm.
relationship you have with yourself. What do you think, Nedra?
Yeah, I think it's a self-betrayal when you fold on your own boundary. You are sending the message that perhaps you can be manipulated, that you say stuff and you don't even stick to it. And people really pick up on that and they run with it. And if you try to set another boundary, they'll do the same thing, because they know that they can wear you down, because you've shown them that if they do a few things, that you no longer have a boundary. And that is, it's a very sad event, because you're betraying yourself. And I think your goal is to have the boundary. So that's why it's important for you to learn how to deal with the discomfort of setting the boundary. And the discomfort is the guilt, the sadness, maybe breaking this family cycle, the
Shame.
isolation. What was that?
Shame as well.
Shame, the loneliness, all of that discomfort that comes along with setting a boundary. I saw someone put in the comments that family is the hardest group of people to set boundaries with, and that's absolutely true. um, but what I've noticed with family is I've done workshops on boundaries. And when people start talking about family, I have an exercise where I say, if your mom is the hardest person to set boundaries with, tell me how she has respected someone's boundaries. And almost everybody is respecting someone's boundaries, whether that's the law, whether that's at work, whatever that is. So everybody is respecting boundaries. Now tell me why they aren't respecting your boundaries. Because everybody else probably has consequences. They have, like these things in place that if you come to work late, 5 times, you're fired. There's a clear consequence. So when you say things like, because someone else in the comments, people don't always accept boundaries. They don't have to, because boundaries are optional. You can say to someone, I would like you to call before you come over, and they can still show up. What do you do? What is the consequence if people are not respecting your boundary? It's your boundary. People can do whatever they want to do. What do you do when they do that whatever?
Completely. There's a lot of reasons why people are not respecting your boundaries. One, the tone is not firm, or it's blaming or critical. Two, there's no consequences. Completely. I love what you said. I love what you just said. The people that are not respecting your boundaries, they are respecting other types of boundaries,
Mm-hmm.
because there are consequences.
Mm-hmm.
If they're not respecting yours, it's because they're not receiving the consequence. So they know you are manipulatable, or
Mm-hmm.
however you say it.
I
I'm sorry,
love that word,
basic Spanish.
manipulatable. I'm going to write that down.
Coincidence? Okay. Uh-huh. And maybe you're backing down again. You're backing down. So they understand. Obviously, you're not. Your boundary isn't real. It's not even trustworthy. The boundary that you're setting.
Mm-hmm.
It's a threat. Or an ultimatum that it's not true. unrealistic threats. When you start continually saying unrealistic threats, again, you give them the sign that it's another unrealistic threat. They lack appreciation for your needs or values. I always say that when you start setting boundaries and when you start being very assertive and authentic, you kind of do a social cleanse. There's people that are going to stay in your life that are even going to applaud your boundaries, and there's people that are going to leave. And those people that leave, I always say, open the door. Open the door, because those are people that the only reason they were in your life is because they were benefiting from your lack of boundaries, from your continuous self-betrayal. That's why they were there, because your self-betrayal was benefiting them. And now that you're, being true to yourself, it's not working for them. And that's okay. Those are the people that you should literally open the door. Thank them for whatever they taught you, because people always teach you something, and that's it, and say goodbye. And yeah, maybe there's going to be a grieving process, but again, we have to start allowing ourselves to feel. What else? The lack of support system. If you don't have a support system, it's really, really hard to set boundaries, because we need that connection. So if it's whoever it is, a friend, a mom, a dad, a community, and people from the church, or a therapist, or a coach. But I always say, if you're starting to place boundaries for the first time, you need a support system, because if not, it can be very hard to deal with all of those feelings alone. And the last one I put here is the contradiction between your words and actions. What do you think, Nedra?
I think those are all very important reasons that people don't listen to your boundaries. I think sometimes we think that just saying it once is enough, and it's not. We have to repeat ourselves, because we've created certain patterns and relationships that we're now trying to break. So they are used to you allowing them to do this thing. And now you're saying, oh, you can't do this anymore. So of course, I mean, it's, I have 2 kids. So if I give them candy 5 days in a row, and on the 6th day I say no candy, they're going to ask me 1,000 times on the 6th day, because they just had candy. So they're going to keep testing me. Now, if I go, with kids, they say 3 days. So if I go, day 6, day 7, day 8, no candy, I'm probably good. But if I give in on day 7, they're back to asking me again and again and again. And that's the piece that I think we forget, that if you're going to set a boundary, please be ready to execute it. People that you say stuff that you don't stick to. And if that is the case, they will continue to try to take advantage of you. You are showing them the weak spots. And so they will take advantage of that, because let's face it, nobody wants to respect boundaries. I certainly don't in some cases. I would love to show up to, work late and, just drive as fast as I want to. But we know the consequences, right? And so we don't do these things, because there's a very clear consequence. If you do this, this is what will happen. And so we respect these boundaries. We respect these things, because we want to be in the situation. I don't want tickets. So we respect the boundary. But I think sometimes we think that issuing a consequence is so hard, and we go to the opposite extreme. So if you're in a relationship and you ask someone for something, you think if they don't do it right away, oh, I have to cut the relationship off. No, there's a lot of things you can do before you cut a person off. And it's worth thinking about different consequences. If someone comes to your house unannounced and you want them to call before, perhaps you do let them in and you remind them that time. And then if they do it again, you say, hey, I asked you to call. I'm not available right now. Let's set up a time so we can meet that works for both of us. there are things you can do. It doesn't mean I have to stop talking to this person because they don't respect my boundary. What are the other things that you could do? Because this is new for them. They're not used to you having boundaries. You are teaching them a new part of you. They're used to you not having boundaries. So this whole rule you just made up, it's new. It's, the rules that we have now, like go out and wear a face mask. You still see people with no face mask. It's a new rule. So there, it's going to be a process to get people on board with any new rule that you're setting. So if it is your rule, continue to execute it.
I love it. Love it so much. I also feel that I see a pattern that people that lack boundaries, they take boundaries as something personal. People that don't understand boundaries or lack boundaries themselves, when somebody sets boundaries with them, it feels personal and they don't like it. And they are the one who pushes back. So I think that one huge benefit of starting to access your boundaries and establishing boundaries is that you start understanding the boundaries of others, you start respecting their boundaries, and you stop making them personal. You start understanding that it's all about needs, personal needs. And I think that's one of the best works that I've ever seen when people start setting boundaries.
When people have taken it personally, I like to say it's about, it is about you, but it's also about me, because you're right. It is about you. It is about this thing that you're doing, but it's about me because I have an issue with this thing that you're doing. So I just don't like this thing in general, but you happen to be the person doing this thing. So I need you to do X, Y, and Z. It's not that you can't do this with other people. There are other people who will accept this behavior from you. There are other people who might like it. There are other people who don't have an issue with, but I have an issue with it. So in our relationship, this is what I need from you. So it's not that it is on some, it's not personal, but it's personal. And I think that's really hard, especially when people are very sensitive and they don't have boundaries. Hearing another person say to them, this is what I need, particularly when they're able to operate in a similar way in other unhealthy relationships. Yes, they have a really hard time with that. And it's like, why are you saying that to me? No one else says that to me. And you can be the first. I'm a trailblazer. I'm the first person to say it to you. This is what I need from you.
So
Go ahead.
the reason why I say it's not personal is because this is how I define boundaries. Boundaries for me is what happens and what doesn't happen in a certain space. So that space, for example, when it's personal boundaries, is me. What do I allow and what do I not allow in terms of my values, as somebody said there. So Nedra, let's say a stranger comes to Nedra and holds her hand, and let's say Nedra loves people to hold her hand, and she has no issue with it. She would even like, thank you for holding my hand. Let's say that would be the case, and then somebody comes to me random and holds my hand, and I don't like it. I don't feel comfortable. I don't know this person. It doesn't mean that my boundary of please do not hold my hand is right or wrong. It's just me. It's my level of comfortableness, so it's not a right or wrong. We don't even have to label it. It's just a personal need. So if somebody comes and holds my hand and I don't want them to hold my hand, it's not because they're unworthy. That's what I talk about when I talk about personal. The reason why I said that is because when people don't like boundaries is usually because they think that somebody's telling them that they're not worthy. That's how they translate it. If you're rejecting me, if you're telling me to not go to your house before calling, somehow it gives me like the meaning that I place on the boundary is that I'm not worthy. That's what I usually see in my practice, that's the translation that the people give when it has nothing to do about your value or your worthiness. It has to do with what me, Stephanie, or whoever is placing the boundary is comfortable with. And that's what I think it's most important, because people really tend to place meanings that have nothing to do with the reality of the situation.
I want to jump to this comment that says, I'm not worthy of being able to cross this boundary. That is amazing because, yes, people want this sort of I shouldn't have rules with you access. And that's how I determine our closeness, because the rules that you have for me are not like anyone else. I get to do all of these things and you don't say anything to me, but maybe you can't. It's okay for you to say these things with other people, but just not to me. Um,
There's a word, I'm trying to look for the word as well. There's
okay.
entitlement, no?
Entitlement. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. People feel entitled to be able to have a certain level of access, and really you get to determine that. And especially when you've allowed things in a relationship for so long, people really feel entitled. I think it's easier, of course, to implement boundaries in the beginning of relationships because that's kind of when you're setting things up. But if you've been accepting, tolerating, dealing with resentment for a long period of time and you try to implement the boundary, people are very, very entitled to, how dare you? I thought because of who I am to you that I was exempt from you having any rules with me.
Completely. And specifically, if they have traumas from their past of abandonment, it can be a trigger for them when you set a boundary that you're gonna abandon them. Or if they grew up in a place where everything that they wanted, it was always given, where there was no boundaries, there was never a no. You want this toy, I'll give you this toy. There was never a boundary in their life. So they grow up, they become adults, and you set a boundary and they don't like it. And the people that don't like it and become very aggressive, it can be really scary if you grew up in a place where anger was seen as was translated to abuse. If you grew up in a place where anger was literally abuse and you were kind of always walking on eggshells, when you try to set up a boundary when you are already an adult and you sense anger, it can be very triggering for you to take that boundary away and apologize and not have boundaries because you sense danger. So being able to heal and try to understand that anger does not mean abuse and that you're safe now, it's a huge process, and it's critical for you to start setting boundaries. What do you think?
Yeah, I think, someone just asked what's the difference between boundaries and walls. And I think walls are a protective strategy that are applied to most instances, where boundaries are more of a personalized process to fit a circumstance. So, for instance, when you talk about like abuse in relationships, have a wall. Don't accept certain levels of abuse, right? And in other situations, it may be more appropriate when things are not abusive, when they're not toxic, to have a boundary and not a wall. But someone recently asked me, like, is it ever okay to have a wall? And I thought, in some certain circumstances, yeah, like if having a wall keeps people from physically, sexually harming you, yeah, have a wall. Keep
and
those things
and
out.
emotionally and
Yeah, and
emotionally as well.
emotionally. Keep those things out. But in terms of, people coming to your house late, or people not driving and you want them to drive, like these sorts of things, those are boundaries. Those are not wall issues. Those are boundary issues. Those are things that you can say to someone. I don't know if you can talk someone out of physically abusing you, if you can set a boundary and say, hey, don't hit me anymore. I think they know that and they're doing it anyway. And so that's when you need to have a structure of, okay, I cannot tolerate this sort of thing. This is my rule for certain sorts of behavior.
This is critical, what you just said. Like, again, if setting a boundary is going to put you in a in a dangerous situation, don't set it. You have to cut
Mm-hmm.
it off, and you have to do it safely. Therapists are there to develop a safety plan. You can call the domestic violence hotline, But definitely don't set a boundary right now. If you feel that you're in danger, you just have to get help to create a safety plan. I think that's a very important thing to say right now, specifically because I'm hearing that domestic violence is increasing due to the crisis. You know, people are forced to stay at homes and there's more conflict than ever. So if you're in that situation, do not set a boundary. Call either 911 or the domestic violence hotline, which you can find it online.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let's see the questions. There's so many.
What about kids? Kids need boundaries too. That's what bedtime is. Bedtime is a boundary. I know it's a boundary in my house. Kids go, parents can have time without